everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Yonsei Descendants of Topaz panel discussion. I'm Kimiko Marr of JAMP, and I also happen to be a Yonsei Descendant of Topaz, which I probably mentioned before in a couple of live streams. I'm going to have three descendants join me, Saya, Midori, and Patrick. And but first, I wanted to play a video that we recorded a couple of weeks ago, where we just kind of do introductions and talk about how we are affiliated or tied to Topaz. So I'm going to go ahead and play that. It's about 40 minutes. And then after the video plays, we're going to bring everybody on screen and do a Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, type them in the chat. And please have lots of questions because we're all excited to answer anything that you have there for us. So I am going to go ahead and start this video, and I'll see you in about 40 minutes. Marr, and I am here with Patrick, Saya, and Midori, and all four of us are Yonsei, and we are descendants of people who were incarcerated in Topaz during World War II. And I know that I've shared a little bit about my family in past broadcasts. So my grandparents and my mom, aunt, and uncle were all in Topaz. So I just want to start off with a little background. So I'm just going to ask each person to tell us how they're connected to Topaz. So Patrick, you tell us first, how are you connected to Topaz?
All right. I am connected to Topaz through my grandfather. Mitsuo Komatsu. He went by Mitz his whole life, Mitz Komatsu. He was born in 1918. So when the order for incarceration came, he would have been in his early 20s, thereabouts. And then he was sent to Topaz alone. Grandpa, his story was kind of unique in a way. His mom actually died shortly after he was born as part of the Spanish flu epidemic. And his dad had, before World War II even broke out, his dad had left the U.S. to go back to Japan. So by the time that war broke out, the only family that he actually still had in the U.S. was his sister, Nikkei. She was sent to Heart Mountain. So he was, incarcerated first at Tanforan, then in Topaz as a single man. Based on the research that I've done, I don't think that he was there for very long. I don't think he was even there for a full year before he obtained clearance to leave camp. When he did get that clearance, he went to Chicago, spent time there. His sister eventually was able to join him in Chicago. She actually has a sad story. She passed away in like 1947 or 1949 from lupus. But then he was just in Chicago, eventually met my grandmother there in the 50s. They had my mom, and, he was part of the Japanese American community there in Chicago. Pretty much from when he got there in the 40s, through, actually it was 1970. They left Chicago in 1970. And my grandma was from Kentucky, and she wanted to move back home, and that's what they did. And that's kind of how I ended up in Kentucky now.
My mom's side was incarcerated. Both my mom's parents were at Topaz, and their siblings and their parents. And so, yeah, I think my grandparents were around high school, college age when they were there, and it dispersed some of the family. And my mom's uncle ended up in Boston afterwards. Her mom was in Chicago for a little while, but then they all ended up back in Oakland, which is where they were before they were sent to Topaz. And a lot of my mom's family is still in the Bay Area.
I don't know much. My grandmother was incarcerated at Topaz. I think she was around 14 or 15 when she went in.
How long have you known about your family that was in camp? Was it something that you always knew about? Did you discover it at some point later? Did you discuss any of this with your parents? Patrick, how about you? Did you know your grandpa?
Yes, yes. Grandpa, he played a big part in my early life. We were fortunate to have him until he was about 97 or so. So I was, very fortunate to have my grandpa in my life, pretty much through my mid-20s.
Did he ever talk about camp to you?
The very first moment in my life that I can remember kind of first becoming aware of camp, even in kind of like an abstract way, is starting from when I was very young, maybe 4, 5, 6 or so. I would be over at my grandpa's house, and he had this old box of photographs, and these photographs, they were from various points in his life. Not there's some. He lived in Chicago. There were some photographs of things that had happened in Chicago in there, but there were also these photographs from camp. I would later realize, because they there would be photos just kind of like the barracks, the barrack style buildings, and there would be some photos of other Japanese Americans, in these camp environments. And he would show me these photos, but he never really wanted to talk about them. And so this was something that he would do occasionally, more than once, growing up. He would take out this box of photos. We would look at them together. And, if I asked a question like, oh, where's this? He might be like, oh, well, this was in camp or something. But, there was never we never really had any deep conversations. And in fact, as I got older and tried to have some of these longer, deeper conversations with him, he really didn't want to have them. And on my own journey, as I've learned more about the Nikkei experience, I've learned how common that is. That a lot of Nikkei who were incarcerated, they really don't like to talk about it, even still, because it's painful for them. So we would have very kind of, I guess, to bring that back to your original question, we would have small conversations, bits and pieces here and there over the years. But the very first moment where I very first began to learn of that history was Grandpa bringing out that box of photos, at certain points over the course of his life. And that was the one thing that really got me curious, and I guess wanting to learn more about this. I think that he wanted me to know about, what had happened to him. And I think that it was something that he wanted to share with me. But, getting into the details and, him describing what happened to him, verbally, I think was just something that he didn't want to do. I just have this, when I was in high school, I tried to, one of my English teachers wanted me to write a paper about his experiences. And so I tried to interview him. And one memory that has always stuck with me is when I was trying to interview him for that paper, I was asking him about his sister. And at this point in time, I didn't even know, he had never even shared his sister's name. And I just remember, trying to get him, well, Grandpa, what was your sister's name? And eventually he did tell me, but there was just such a look of pain on his face. And, I'll always remember that. And, after that, I really, I tried to respect his boundaries about what he wanted to share much more. But yeah, I think that pulling out those photographs was his way of trying to share what had happened to him with me in a way that he felt comfortable doing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I grew up mostly in New Jersey, from elementary school through high school, and we would go and visit my grandparents in Berkeley at least once a year, I think. And actually, that's so interesting that you were talking about interviewing your grandpa in high school, because I also interviewed my grandpa in high school about the camps, and he started off by kind of making jokes and saying that's where I learned how to gamble, and like it was a great time and all these things. And then by the end of it, he was crying, and it kind of, yeah, my mom was there too, and I think it was kind of this like just crazy moment where, and he was like a very strong, like he didn't show like emotions like that. So I think that was another one of those experiences where I was like, oh, it shows how powerful, like, or how not talking about the camp, you know, and that generation being like that, it like, it really was like just these things held inside. But yeah, I didn't, other than that, talk too much to my grandparents. I think they both died when I was in high school and then college, and so I wish I had talked to them more about it. Going to the Tule Lake pilgrimage, I think I went in 2016. That totally opened my eyes. I kind of hadn't, I think being there, meeting people, hearing those stories, connecting with so many people, that like was transformative. And it totally brought me into this, like, yeah, we need to hear these stories. These people are still alive. Like it's just made it like much more real, I think. And it would be people like who I was meeting who knew my grandparents and things like that. So it's like bringing the community smaller, and because I have a pretty small family otherwise. And so it kind of made that world feel bigger.
When you were talking to your grandpa, and he, you know, when you're interviewing him, and he, you know, it kind of ended with him being very emotional. Do you remember what he was sharing with you that got him to that point?
I don't remember exactly what he said, but I think something just along the lines of like, that wasn't okay, or it's just really terrible, or something along those lines. It's definitely something where I think when I was young, like younger, like elementary school and middle school, even through high school, like I kind of wasn't as connected with that side of the history in my family. And then in high school, I think I started to get a little bit more interested, and kind of like realizing a little bit more of the things. Like I wrote a paper also about like just the term concentration camp, and like how that has been used in different places, and that also like helped me kind of like do more research, and just think about like how it's such recent history that we're all connected to.
So how about you, Midori? I know that I heard that your grandma wrote some memories about Topaz. So did you personally, so did you know your grandma? Did you actually have these conversations with her?
Only right before she passed. She passed when I was like 13 or 14. So I felt it was important to get that narrative. I don't know like what exactly motivated me to do that, but yeah, she never spoke about it prior. So once we found out that she was going to pass away, she did write very briefly about her experience, and like Wakasa's passing was in that. So yeah, that's kind of all I was able to get from it. But I still have her yearbook actually from her incarceration. But yeah, those are the kind of only two pieces that I was able to gather. And then my grandfather, he passed away before I was born, so I never got to meet him and get his story. But
so prior to your to you kind of deciding to ask your grandma about her time in camp, did you really know about it? Did you talk about it like with your mom, or was that something that was kind of a new topic for you?
no, I never talked about it with any other family members. I know like it happened, and I don't know how I came to that knowledge. So I knew to some degree that something happened there, but I didn't really know the specifics, and my family never really talked about it. Just kind of recently, I've been slightly diving into the research, and just with like things like Day of Remembrance, things people share things on social media, and I've just been really interested in like the thriving Japanese American communities prior to their incarceration, and these like very successful businesses and farming communities, and specifically in my area, Seattle, like where I lived, there was supposedly like over 300 families that were thriving, and I garden a lot as a hobby, so it's kind of a nice way to reconnect with those kind of ancestral roots. And I try and sell cut flowers as like a side business, so it's kind of nice to feel like I'm kind of rekindling that spirit that previous families before me had.
For each of you, for your identity, do you feel like you're still on this journey of understanding your Nikkei side? Do you wish that you had known more growing up? What are your thoughts just, as adults now?
One thread that I think has been kind of consistent in some of the comments that we've all been talking about so far is just kind of this theme of discovery, and what that discovery, what that discovery means, I think is going to be a little bit different for each person. But speaking as a Yonsei, I mean, there has been, an element of discovery, even as someone who, who was very fortunate to have my grandpa, who directly experienced the incarceration. I had him and was very fortunate to have him for, 25 years. There was still so much that I didn't know, so much that even my mom didn't know. And, I have found that bringing geography into the mix, as someone growing up in Kentucky, there's not really a Japanese American community in Kentucky, or if there is, I don't know about it. There has been just a huge element of discovery when I think about my own Yonsei identity.
Have you always identified as being Nikkei, as being part Japanese, like ever since you were a child, or has that been a more recent, since you said you feel like more white passing?
Yeah, it has absolutely been, a more recent development. I think, certainly within like the past decade, I started to kind of quote unquote seriously study JA history and the history of the incarceration, when I was an undergrad. And as someone who is white passing and has a lot of white privilege, at first I didn't want to claim something, that I had no right claiming. That was something that I felt that I needed to study, very carefully. And that's something that, I had to think a lot about. And, it's still something that I think a lot about. I don't suppose anyone remembers, gosh, this has been years ago now, but Rachel Dolezal.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't want to be Rachel Dolezal, I don't want to be like, I don't want to do that. But, as I have learned more about, Japanese American history, and, as I've listened to and read, the thoughts and the experiences of other Nikkei, I guess I was able to arrive at this conclusion that there are many things that go into the experience of being Nikkei, and it is not something that can necessarily be essentialized into, just an experience of race. Race is certainly a part of it, or can be part of it, but it can't be boiled down just to that. And so I think that reaching that conclusion for me, is what helped me finally feel comfortable, in being able to say that, I do have a Nikkei identity.
I feel like for when I was growing up, I was like a little confused, or I think I just saw our family as kind of this bizarre, like, so my parents lived in Tokyo for I think 14 years, and my brother and I were born there, and we moved to Dallas when I was 3, and then we moved to New Jersey when I was 6. So I think those 3 places were like each very different. So it's funny because in New Jersey, I think I felt like I was kind of part more of this diverse community of people. Like, most of my best friends were Jewish, Indian American. It's funny, my grade in high school, I think was like 100 people. And I think we had 6 Hapa girls. It's funny because being in New Jersey, it was definitely its own experience. But then once I came out to Berkeley, and now I live in LA, and I feel like here I have so many of my best friends here are Asian American, but their parents were immigrants. And that is its own very different situation as well, where like I feel like when I was in New Jersey, it was much more of like this kind of, I don't know, with being mixed, I think there's this kind of like individualized sense of you're pulling from all these different things, and it's kind of very, I mean, everyone of course unique to you, but because there's this mixture of things, you like create your own little world of cultural identity. Whereas like a lot of my friends here who are Asian, it's a lot of it more about being part of that community, sharing all of these same understandings of how to do things. And I've like loved that too. I feel like it's like also opened a whole side of like the Asianness that I never felt before until I moved here.
So, and then, you know, like when you were in school, since you were in school in different places, how did you feel like, where were you living when you first like had an American history class? Was that in New Jersey or was that somewhere else?
Yeah, I think so. And I love my US history teachers, but I do not remember talking about the camps at all. I have no memory of it. And so I'm sure it maybe happened at some point, but not in a way that stuck with me. And I feel like everyone I talk to says the same thing about it being a paragraph in your textbook. Out here and on the West Coast, I think people are more aware of the history. On the East Coast, it felt like it was not something that, I was understood in the same way.
You know, I don't really remember, to be honest, but it's very possible. I actually worked at a nonprofit during like the year of 2020 as like an engagement teacher. So I had like a classroom of 16 and they were different ages, but we kind of helped them with their online school. And actually in the 2nd grade, they were actually teaching the internment camp. So I was pretty impressed, but it also felt like a young age to be like introducing them. Like especially online, they just weren't as engaged to the material. But I do think, at least where I am, that it's much more a part of the curriculum now because I don't really remember it being significant. I also think, like, even though it is so limited in curriculum, that it's also disappointing that so much of marginalized people's history is about like the negative experiences of our time here. And so it would be nice to have more acts of resilience and resistance and more like positive experiences instead of just the negative ones in our upbringing. And yeah, to be able to defer to children or to people who've experienced it and have, you know, a richer understanding of it, because we are the experts. And so for teachers to be able to have that open dialogue and to understand that education is like a mutual exchange. It's not always, you know, the adult has all the answers all the time. It would be a nice shift to see.
Have you always identified as Nikkei, as part Japanese, or, you know, obviously you have a Japanese first name, so you can't really, I mean, me as well, right? You can't really separate it. But was that always a part of how you thought of yourself?
Because I never really presented as Asian, I was never really perceived as Asian. So a lot of people would think I'm like Hispanic or something. But and then a lot of my friends are, like Saya said, like they're first generation, and their families, you know, they weren't born here, or they were the first generation born here. So although I kind of hang around predominantly Asian people, I just felt like my experience was very different. So I think, yeah, since like becoming like a mother, I've tried to explore just my ancestral history and my racial identity and how to kind of come to terms with like the constant confusion of it all, I think.
How many of you have actually visited the Topaz site? So for Saya and Midori, do you all have a desire to go out there? Is there like, or are you just kind of like, you know, I'm good?
I definitely want to go.
What do you think what do you think it'll be like compared to how you felt at Tule Lake? Do you think you'll feel differently?
I would imagine being there, imagining my family members who I, knew and everything. Like I would think, yeah, I would, have a like knowing like where they exactly were living. If like you can walk around the land and know that kind of thing. I would love to do that. I think it's really important.
What about you, Midori? Do you think that I don't know, what do you think it would be like?
Yeah, I hope to go. I kind of debate whether I'd want to bring my daughter or not because she probably wouldn't understand, but I'd hope to have a cathartic kind of experience because, like so much of the narrative was like shikata ganai, like it cannot be helped, and I think having conversations like these and bringing that narrative to the surface is like really important and like healing for our community. So yeah, I think it would be pretty transformative experience to visit and see like how isolating it actually is, and yeah, just the landscape of it all and everything, and the commute to it, and yeah.
What about you, Patrick? So you went. When did you go, and what was your reaction?
There were definitely several elements of the experience, or of my experience that I think I can relate to, what Midori was saying. Firstly, the isolation and the remoteness of the location, just getting there, took so long. And so the major, well, it's not a major town, but the town that is closest to the campsite, if I'm remembering correctly, is Delta, Utah. And just looking at, Delta, Utah, which is, a very, very small rural town. So the experience of traveling there, I think, really did emphasize to me the remoteness of the camp and, the isolation of it. But honestly, what I still remember most about it, and being there, is when you go to the actual site of the camp, was just the silence, like the complete and utter silence, that is there. And I think about that silence, and I just think about how once there must have been, so much sound, with, thousands and thousands of people living there. But unless the site, was, or, if the site was not marked off as it is today, it would be hard to tell that there was anything ever there at all. I do think that it is something worth experiencing, just to set foot, on the same ground, where your grandparents or great grandparents, might have, been walking. I think it was very powerful, but yeah, just kind of sorting through all of the emotions about how I feel going there, I guess is something that I'm still doing, And I will say too, I did go there with my mom and dad, but I something that is on my bucket list is, hopefully going to the site as part of a pilgrimage. And I think that would be, a very, different experience from going to the site, alone or just with your family.
So I'm curious, Midori, for your daughter, what would you want her to learn about Topaz, about your grandmother's time there, about the incarceration in general, about being part Nikkei? I mean, I know that's a really effing huge question I just asked you, but you know, like, you know, what do you hope for her and others of her generation, being Gosei, that, you know, she's probably also going to not look Japanese when she's, you know, grown up. She's going to look maybe mixed race or whatever, but people might not necessarily identify her as being Japanese. Is that important to you for her to learn and know about that part of your family's history?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, she's very white passing. She has like blue eyes and like light almost blonde hair, even though she's only half white. Um, so yeah, I think like now we even like it feels powerful even to do like small acts like grow Japanese cucumbers and make tsunamono, and like I want to have a foundation of like her culture, even if it's like reduced to food or you know something small, but it feels significant to me. And I mean, she's only 4 now, but I feel like I want to have a very transparent relationship with her. When she's old enough to be able to understand like the gravity of it. I, you know, want her to read similar literature that I have, and read, you know, my grandmother's writings, and because I do think it affects our lineage and kind of struggles that you know she probably will have to face to some degree too. So um, I don't know exactly like how that'll manifest or what it'll look like.
Yeah, I'm just, you know, curious as to how the three of you see the history being told up to this point. And I don't mean just exclusively at Topaz, I just mean in general. And are there any ways that you would like to see it taught possibly differently?
But, you know, I mean, I think another great way to teach the history is to honestly do what we're doing now, you know, and to bring in the experiences of, you know, people today who, you know, still have connections to the history, even, you know, though they weren't physically there when, you know, the history happened. You know, like I was talking earlier, you know, when I, you know, tell my students, you know, that this is something that I have a personal connection to, you know, it tends to make them want to listen more because I think it makes it more real to them. And so I think that, you know, if when we are doing that as Yonsei by, you know, describing how this has affected us, you know, I think that, you know, that is a very, I think that can be a very powerful teaching tool just in and of itself.
I totally agree with everything that Patrick was just saying, and I agree. Yeah, these oral histories. I think anything when you have this personal connection, more exposure in the media. Like I just saw Everything Everywhere All at Once, amazing, and then because of that, like listening to a podcast, sharing with a friend, people who are outside of the community, like hearing experiences that way. Like just the more it kind of starts to blend into everyone's lives in different ways and is connected in more, you know, in an organic way, I think that that's when it starts to like be more impactful.
I think that it is a misconception of some of the older generations that Yonsei either aren't interested in learning the history or don't care about the history or don't feel connected to the history. And I'll start with you this time, Midori. What do you think about that as a Yonsei? Do you agree with that, or do you have a different opinion?
I mean, to some degree, I agree. I think we all have to confront like our narratives about how we belong to this experience and story. Um, but I don't think that's like a universal to think that we don't care to be involved or be a voice in this community. But I think, yeah, how to have conversations with different generations to bridge that gap, and how we could be of service or fit in, or I think, yeah, there's just kind of a lot of confusion of like what that looks like, and how to show up in a respectful and proper way. And I think culturally we do kind of look to our elders to like be the voices, and we don't want to like overstep that level of respect. So maybe we do kind of stay more quiet and reserved and don't really speak our mind as much as maybe we should. That would be more constructive. So
yeah, I think that's definitely part of the conflict that's specific to the JA experience, where it's like, because there were these generations that weren't wanting to talk about it for whatever reasons, that now more people are finding their voices or wanting to tell the stories or wanting to learn the stories because they were never shared with them. So I think it's a little bit, yeah, I think it's like starting to now figure out how that works more.
And so do you feel like because out of respect for elders, or you know, maybe if people feel like they're not as educated on the history or the experience, but do you feel like Yonsei need to be invited into the conversation, because they're not going to just like pop out and go, "Hi, I'm here and I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking"? Is that kind of like, how do we engage Yonsei and Gosei? And believe it or not, there are Rokusei out there. So I mean, seriously, how do we, you know, what does that look like for the three of you, since you are Yonsei? You know, is it kind of like you have to be kind of asked and said, here, you are allowed, you can speak your mind here, or what? I mean,
I think things like Sudi for Solidarity that are kind of like bridging current like issues that aren't necessarily just like learning a history. I don't know how to say this, but maybe people feel like they have a little bit more knowledge about like a contemporary situation where they can then speak their mind about like from their experience instead of speaking for their elders or something like that. Like I could see how that might be a way that Yonsei might feel more able to get involved. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard because I don't feel the like movement necessarily within the Yonsei community necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to just kind of connect to some of the things that both Saya and Midori have said, it's just, I do think that there is this, I mean, how do you describe it? There is this like, the Sansei have been, you know, leaders in the community for so long now, and you know, I think, not to disparage them, because, you know, I love them and I think they're great, but I do think that, you know, because they have been in these leadership roles for so long, I mean, you know, when I think of like the quote unquote Sansei experience, I mean, you know, they were, you know, really in the position to, you know, like lead on things like, you know, the redress movement and the Asian American movement, and, you know, they have, you know, been kind of generationally positioned to be the leaders for so long that it's kind of just like, well, when you have your own idea, it's just like, well, you don't want to step on any toes, you know, intentionally or unintentionally. So I think there is that kind of culture of almost like not wanting to rock the boat, or you know, just wanting to be respectful of our elders. So I 100% agree that that is a thing.
okay, so let's bring on our panelists, Saya, Midori, and Patrick. So Saya currently lives in Los Angeles. Patrick is in Kentucky, and Midori is in Seattle. Thank you all so much for being willing to be here live and answer some questions. We have lots of questions. Yay. So excited about that. But before that, I wanted to just kind of, I know that video piece kind of ended abruptly. So I wanted to just finish off the thought of how can Yonsei and Gosei and Rokusei be encouraged to be a part of or feel a part of the Japanese American community, or to get involved with Japanese American community groups, telling the story, talking about the history. Does anybody want to go first, answer that question? Patrick?
I can take a stab at it, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this is to that question, Kimiko. I think that this is one area where social media can actually be used for good instead of evil. Like what we're doing right now, powered on YouTube to an extent. I know that a lot of my own questions and a lot of the different segments of my own, journey as a Nikkei have been helped along by meeting and talking with people online, on certain Facebook groups, Nikkei Chicago and Japanese American Roots, Facebook groups like that. And, there are others. Those are just kind of the two that came to mind off the top of my head. But those are really, or they can be really easy ways to engage. So that's, I guess, my first thought. And then my other thought that I'll mention just really quickly is, I think that something that I kind of mentioned a little bit in the pre-recording was, this theme of discovery, like as Yonsei or as Gosei or as Rokusei, I think you can decide where you want to begin. Something that I did a couple summers ago was, I decided that I wanted to teach myself how to do a little bit of origami. And so, that was one thing that I learned to just connect with a little bit of my Japanese heritage. So I think, and that freedom can be scary too, well, where do I begin? Well, you can begin wherever you want. But I think that once you can kind of accept the scariness of that, you can really kind of embrace the freedom of that too.
What about you, Sayar Midori? Do you have any suggestions on how Yonsei can get more involved? Okay, Patrick disappeared, but we'll keep going. I'm sure he'll be back. So, Saya, you're unmuted. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think everything Patrick said, I totally agree with. And
there he is.
Just finding your local institutions, like, I don't know, like in LA, like going to JANM and like talking to people within your family. And I think just, I have a friend who just was kind of asking me this kind of thing. She like wants to get more involved and find out, ways to get more involved in these communities. And there's so many different organizations. I was like Nikkei Progressives, or check out JANM, go to a pilgrimage, like all these things. I think totally agree.
What do you think, Midori?
I don't know if I have anything significant to add. But yeah, I like how Patrick just mentioned even small things that you can do as an individual to like connect. But yeah, I think Seattle, I'm fortunate to be around a larger community that has events and art exhibits that are related to my story. So I'm fortunate in that way.
And that actually leads me to a question for you, Patrick. Since you are born and raised in Kentucky, I'm making an assumption here that there's not a lot of Japanese Americans in Kentucky or a community. So so this is kind of a two-part. For people who live outside of the West Coast who are Nikkei? How do they get involved? And on the flip side, for those of us who live in areas that actually do have communities, how can we reach out to folks and kind of offer them extend a hand and say, you know, please join us, please come be part of our community? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I mean, you know, again, I think to an extent, social media, I think, can again be like a good here. You know, that's one way that can be a little bit of an easier way to, you know, to reach out and to begin to discover things. Um, you know, I think part of it too is to, you know, with your parents, you know, if you know if you're fortunate to still have your parents or your grandparents, you know, try to see what they know, you know, and you know, maybe that's something that you've tried to do before, maybe that's something that you haven't tried to do before, but maybe, you know, with me it was just I had to find, I guess, the right, or I had to realize that the way that my grandpa was trying to share this history with me was not necessarily the way that he wanted to share, or the way that he wanted to share the history with me was not necessarily the way that I wanted the history shared with me. Um, so I guess that's a part of it too, just trying to find that common ground where you can make some of those connections and begin to initiate some of that learning. And you know, for as for the second part of your question, you know, how do people reach out to those of us in Kentucky? You know, I think that maybe looking at the history of some of these historic communities, you know, one of the things, um, I didn't mention this in the recording, but you know, one of the other things that my grandpa had in that box of pictures was he had some letters that he had saved from friends of his that he'd had in Chicago where he was after the war, and you know, they maintained contact for a while. So you know, um, if you're in those communities, you know, if you know of any families that, you know, if they moved away at one point, you know, just maybe ask that question, you know, where did those families end up? And you know, once you find out where they did end up, you know, the story of how they ended up there can, I think, in a lot of cases, probably be pretty interesting. So yeah.
And you kind of already answered. So I know we had a question here to all the panelists. You mentioned about interviewing your grandparents about their camp experiences, but did you have talks with your parents about what they may have learned from their parents? So I know you kind of answered that a little bit, Patrick. And Midori, did you ever have discussions with your mom about what she might have heard from your grandmother about her time in Topaz? No. Um, and Saya, I'm gonna assume that you probably have had some discussions with your mother about your grandparents' time. What kind of things would you two talk about?
Yeah, it's funny actually. We don't even talk as much now about our families as much as just the general experience. Maybe we need to talk after this a little bit more, but yeah, I mean, I think because we had so many family members, I definitely have like different buckets of things that I know about my family members who were in the camps. But I think mostly we talk more about generally the camps and like what that meant and how it's like affected us all and all these kind of maybe the bigger things than the specifics of our family. So yeah, maybe I need to ask some more questions after this. But we do talk about it quite a bit.
Well, you know, and that kind of leads me to another another question. As Yonsei, have you all thought much about generational trauma in how it's been passed down in your own family? I know there's been a lot of talk about it in the last couple of years, which has been great because I think it helps us understand our place and how we fit in maybe like how our parents might behave in some quirky ways, and we realize that this is trauma that's coming back. Have you all thought about that or had discussions about that kind of trauma with your parents? Since I think that all of our grandparents are now deceased, so we can't really have that kind of talk with our grandparents, but have you had that kind of talk with your parents? Has anybody had that kind of talk? Okay, homework. Everybody's got to talk to their parents. To be honest, you know what? Like, I've thought about a lot of things with my mother, but I very rarely do I actually bring them up. Like, do you think you can do this because of this? Okay, well, anyway, let's get back to some of the questions here. Let me go back to the beginning. Okay, so this is a question from Allison. She wants to know, as a Yonsei, I'm curious where each of the panelists felt most encouraged to embrace their Nikkei identity, whether a place, person, or thing. So I guess that could mean if you were, say, at a pilgrimage, or if you were part of a group that is Japanese American. Where do you feel most, I guess, maybe accepted as Nikkei? Maybe that's the, or is there a place?
So I guess I can take a stab at it. Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't know. I don't know, I suppose, if there's been any one. Like, there have definitely been moments where I've been encouraged, but I guess what I'm struggling to think of is that one moment where I've really felt encouraged to embrace it. But I mean, there definitely have been multiple moments over the course of my life where I've felt encouraged to embrace, my Nikkei identity. Um, it was actually, one of my high school teachers who encouraged me to try and research it. That was, I guess, one moment. I lived in Milwaukee for 4 years, and a little bit colder than Kentucky. And, I was fortunate, while I lived in Milwaukee, that I was able to get to know the community in Chicago a little bit, not nearly as much as I wish that I could have. And, but getting to know some of the, JAs who are still living in Chicago, that was a moment for me that really was encouraging and made me feel that I could, further embrace my Nikkei identity. But, again, that's not really one moment so much as, a many, many smaller moments that, took place over the course of, 4 years. So, yeah, that's kind of, there for me anyway. I don't know if there's been one big moment as so much as just like lots of little small ones and medium ones.
How about you, Midori? Is it maybe someplace in Seattle, since there is quite an active Japanese American community there, or a group, or your family?
I'm not really too much involved in the larger Japanese American community. I do like to go to the Japanese Cultural Center here, and there's like a Hoseki Bako, like a thrift store. So me and my daughter like to go there sometimes. There's an annual event here that acknowledges the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we do that every year. Kind of just as a personal hobby. I've been trying to like dip into ikebana a little bit, and I grow a lot of cut flowers and sell them sometimes to people. So I've been kind of like dipping into that and like learning about like how ikebana's philosophy is that it's not separate from like what's going on in our life, and so there's a lot of kind of like philosophical like interest that I've like developed so far, just like out of curiosity, and I've done a little bit of academic work on it, um, and then like a little sorry, my daughter's talking. But and like a little bit of research on like Shinto and Buddhism and kind of the religious practices that my family carried before, Catholicism and stuff like that was so heavily like pressured onto them moving here. So yeah.
What about you, Saya?
Yeah, it's, I had all this time to think about it. No, this has been really awesome. I have to say, like it's crazy. Like it's like I'm hearing all these things like all the time, like in both of these conversations where I'm like, yes, I agree. Everything you're saying makes sense, and I and I totally agree and get it. But other times, I think like I've been talking about like my friends from high school, like the other Hapa girls, like one of my best friends is half Chinese. And so even though it's like not the same at all, I feel like there's something about like when we're together we both like, I think like sink a little bit more into the things that like we love about like that side. Which is kind of I don't know what that's about, but like, and then when I went to the pilgrimage, I actually was in one of the intergenerational discussion groups, and this girl Becca, who I met in that group, afterwards, she just like ran up and she was just like, we're like so similar in so many ways and all that, and like we've totally stayed in touch, and just like you make these connections, I think, with different people and the things that you have in common, whether it's like you love the same food that someone else might, like wouldn't necessarily know what you're talking about. And you just kind of piece those all together, I think. But I don't know, of like one particular time or place or person. And then, of course, being, family, I think, too.
I think pilgrimage is a great, that when I always talk about, that's kind of when I started my journey into the community, because I grew up in Missouri, so I was like Patrick, I didn't have a community. It was just me and my mom, and so it's kind of that same feeling at a pilgrimage where you're just talking to people and you realize, oh my God, I get everything that they're saying. Like they don't have to explain, and you don't have to explain. You kind of, there's this shorthand. So let me scroll through these questions here. I want to make sure that I'm not missing any. Okay, so there was another question, I think, about family. Oh, yeah. There was a question about family. So do any of the panelists have siblings that have joined them on this exploration of their Japanese American roots, which I know, Saya, you did tell us a little bit about, but Patrick and Midori, do you guys have brothers or sisters that you know? What about you, Midori? Do you have a brother or sister?
I have a brother, but I'm definitely probably more interested in this stuff. I think he kind of jokes that like he's like a gay, he identifies as like a gay man, so he kind of feels more involved within like the gender and sexuality and those types of issues, and then I've kind of taken on like the racial issues. So yeah, not taken on, but
yeah. And then Saya, I think I didn't include that part in the video, but tell us about your brother.
My brother, I know, I wish he could like be in this because I don't really want to speak for him. We actually, I would, since we had our last conversation last week, I've been wanting to kind of talk to him more about some of these things because we were talking about things, and I was saying in our discussion last week that I actually am not sure how he feels about some of these things. I think it's very different being as a guy versus a girl. And then he stayed in New York since college, so he's been on the East Coast this whole time. So I think that also has been a fully different experience. So yeah, I think he should be on the next panel.
Okay, well, if he's out there,
and he hasn't been to a pilgrimage, so
open invitation, anytime to come talk. Okay, let's get back to some questions here. Okay, So Ken Mochizuki asks, Sansei are sometimes criticized by some Nisei that Sansei are apathetic about their history legacy, and there's hope now with Yonsei to carry that work on. Do you agree? Do you agree that Yonsei will carry on the be the as I said before in our pre-interview, be the culture bearers when we have to step up? Anyone want to say anything about it?
Yeah, I totally think that we will do that, and yeah, I'm just kind of like, there's so much. So I guess let me try and be direct as I can. I do think the Yonsei are going to step up, and I think part of our work is going to be holding up the Sansei history, which I think sometimes doesn't get, the full attention. I mean, the NJA history, it's often focused on the incarceration, and we talk about the incarceration and focus on the incarceration for good reason, but because of that, I think that sometimes all of the things that the Sansei have done, like with the Asian American movement and the redress movement, that doesn't necessarily get as much of a spotlight as it should. And really, we have had a lot of Sansei out there who have been, total amazing rock stars. And I think that I am certainly in awe of what many Sansei have contributed to our history. And so I do think that there is hope for us to continue that work, but also to continue it by kind of, shining a spotlight on, what the Sansei themselves have done, and, not just what, the Issei and the Nisei have done too. So yeah, I think that hope is alive.
Saya Midori, do you have anything that you want to add to that? Okay. Let's see. Let me go to another. As Yonsei, do each of you see things in you that can be characterized as Japanese? And if so, what? And I'll start off this with just a little because it might help you guys. Not necessarily Japanese specific, but I know that there are things where, for instance, I told this story the other day. There was, it sounds like a joke. So there are 4 Japanese American women sitting at a table, and the waiter brings the bill. What do you think happened? In that scenario, I think a lot of people would go, oh, clearly they fought over the check, because that's just what happens. It's not something we all talk about. It just happens. And it's kind of like that shorthand where there's certain things that you're just kind of, unconsciously trained to do, like try to pay the bill or to be quiet, to not, be out of turn, not speak out of turn, not disrespect your elders. Even, I hate to say it, but I think even there is still a point, even with Yonsei, where Shikata Ganai and Gammon kind of still hang in there. And it may not necessarily be super healthy for our generation to internalize things that way. So, like, I think that's what Gerald is asking. Are there things that you've realized consciously are kind of from your Japanese American side?
Kimiko, I just want to chime in really quickly and say that I'm really so glad that you mentioned Shikata Ganai, because I feel like that was a realization that I had just within the past 2 weeks. Because, I was just, noticing how, anytime I have to deal with something stressful, it's like my knee-jerk reaction is to just be like, oh, well, there's really nothing I can do, just whatever, we'll deal with it. And just days ago, I think I had that realization where I was like, oh my gosh, am I just like Shikata Ganaing, my way through life? And yeah, so I definitely agree and resonate with you saying that, and also with you saying that that is something that maybe we should investigate some and think, well, you know, maybe we shouldn't rely on that, and maybe we shouldn't be quite so maybe we shouldn't lean into that almost reflexive action to wanting to be, you know, Shikata Ganai. Yeah.
Saya Midori, any thoughts on any of that, or Gaman and Shikata Ganai? I know that I personally have been wrestling a lot with that representation in telling the Japanese American story, and kind of holding Gaman and Shikata Ganai up as a not an ideal, but as something that is like really a great trait to have, which it might have been necessary during incarceration, or you know, when you're immigrating to a different place. But I kind of feel like with you know, the Sansei and redress, and you know, they were fighting for things. They were fighting to be seen as, you know, with the Asian American, and so I kind of feel like maybe the Sansei kind of started that. Maybe Shikata Ganai is not like an ideal thing to strive for. Have any of you, you know, Saya Midori, have you noticed that in yourself, or maybe even heard your parents talk in a way that shows that they kind of fall under that, where, you know, things just can't be helped, or you just have to kind of suck it up? Okay, well, that might be something for a future discussion, you know, because I know I like, you know, not everybody has thought about all of these things. So definitely. All right, let's head back to the questions here. I think I've gotten a lot of them. Well, here's an interesting one. I think it was kind of sort of answered in the chat, but Shar asked, is there any other state other than California that makes the incarceration story part of the school curriculum? Which I think Illinois just passed something, not specifically about the incarceration, but Asian American history. Patrick, what about what about in Kentucky? Patrick is a teacher in Kentucky. What is there anything that's in the that's required in the curriculum that has to do with Japanese Americans?
No, there is not. At least the incarceration, or neither the incarceration or any other part of JA history is explicitly mentioned. You know, I guess you could say we have some sections that are a little bit more broadly worded, and you know, it can fit into those more broadly worded sections. But you know, then you end up with the situation where the incarceration could be taught, but do a lot of teachers teach it? No, probably not. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
And I know we all kind of had this moment in our pre-interview where we kind of discussed, and it was a question earlier on from the audience, of what we remember that we were taught in school. And I know I got a little bit of Saya in that edit saying, I don't remember. And I think Midori, I think you said that as well, that you don't really remember learning it in school. And Patrick and I were kind of talking about the whole, you know, it's a paragraph. And I'm just wondering, in that dialogue, I kind of mentioned that I remember being a kid, getting an American history book and flipping to World War II, and like kind of excitedly going, oh, you know, what's there? And then it's like, oh, it's 3 sentences or it's a paragraph, and being kind of disappointed. And then I kind of thought, well, maybe I was disappointed because that was something that would have been special for me, like information that I would have that probably no one else in the class would have. Again, keep in mind, this was in Missouri, so there was nobody else in the class who would know this stuff. And that it was kind of disappointing for me and might have internalized some of that. It's not important. Did you all feel that way when you don't remember really learning about it? So clearly it wasn't a major discussion when you were in school. Do you remember how that felt? Anyone? Bueller? Okay, all right. I'll keep. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Kimiko. I just wanted to. I just saw a question come in from John, and I just wanted to. I got a little distracted by that, and I just wanted to briefly respond. I am very fortunate in that there has not, in my district, there has not been any push against CRT. We are still, allowed to teach, as we ought to be allowed to teach, and there's no currently, fingers crossed, there's currently no pressure for us to conform to any kind of whitewash narrative for the moment. Knock on wood. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, let me keep going here. Here's another one from Allison. Have you heard of any family stories of allyship in or outside the camps? That's interesting. I don't know. I personally don't know of anything with my family specifically. Did your family ever talk about folks that helped them, maybe like that kept their belongings or visited them in camp?
I know my grandma was actually, she was able to leave the camps a little early because she was taken in by a Quaker family in Chicago. And I think my mom and her siblings, I think, are both named after people in that family because they had like shown so much,
I didn't know that.
allyship. Yeah. Maybe not Mike, but I'm pretty sure that it was like so impactful for my grandma to have had that allyship while she was in the camps that allowed her to leave a little early. And then she ended up coming back to Berkeley. But yeah, that's such a great story.
Yeah. I think I've gone through most of the questions in the chat. I apologize to anybody if I didn't get to your question. I do want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about James Wakasa. And I know Midori has told us that her grandmother specifically wrote about James Wakasa when she was writing her memories of camp. But I also just wanted to ask everybody if they had also heard stories, specifically about James Wakasa and his murder from your family members. I know I did not. My family never spoke of it. But Patrick, did your grandfather ever speak of that incident?
No, not I can recall at least. And I mean, part of that might have been because, I do think my grandpa, he was in camp for not a particularly long time before he got approved for clearance. I can't remember the exact dates, but I think he was there less than a year. But no, I'd never recall him mentioning Wakasa. That was something that I learned about, when I kind of first started to look into and study the incarceration in Topaz myself. But yeah, no family stories about Wakasa.
And Midori, would you want to either read what your grandmother wrote or just kind of summarize what she wrote? Because obviously, you said this was kind of shortly before she passed. So, these memories are definitely things that she held on to for 70 years or so, right?
Yeah. She wrote a couple pages, but like a sentence on Wakasa. I don't know how accurate her perception of the event was, But she said, the sad development of the death of an elderly man who couldn't speak English for going too close to the barbed wire fence surrounding the camp and was shot was a blow to the trust we were trying to build. My 15th year became a sad one for us all.
Wow, that's pretty intense. So that if you're kind of putting yourself in her position as a 14, 15-year-old, then she kind of didn't trust, I'm guessing, the administration or the military police, or, I mean, that would be a really intensely frightening thing to feel, I think. Or what do you think, Midori?
I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like to some degree it might have been easier in comparison to like younger children because she has a bit more of a concept to a degree of what's happening. And I mean, she's still, a minor, but yeah. And to probably to think that that could have been, one of her family members, and um, that he was completely innocent, and I'm sure it feels very disempowering to have experienced that. Yeah, I'm not really sure.
And then Saya, I think your grandmother used to speak about.
Yeah, my mom has talked about how her mom, like one night at dinner, got really emotional, saying it's so unfair and not right that he was killed. And but I definitely didn't know before the last few years, I think, about Wakasa. I think you always had learned about these relocation centers as kind of these like places where people were held, and I don't remember ever hearing like anything that sounded as so violent, like everything was always sounded very benign. And so that was pretty shocking when I first found out about
How did
that.
that change your perception?
It just kind of furthered the feeling that it's kind of pushed under the rug and not, explained as, this history is still kind of just brushed over as something that, I don't know, still spoken about like it was now. I mean, maybe not now, not as much, but it feel like growing up, I definitely felt like it was kind of this, not so terrible thing. And I think that kind of just reaffirmed that the not talking about murder. Yeah.
And so then now kind of the reason why we all know each other is because of the what happened with the Wakasa monument, and their different levels of what how people are involved with that. But I'm just curious, and I guess we can start with you, Midori. So how did you come to hear about what happened, and how did you feel?
I saw it on Facebook. I don't know what specific group shared the article. It's hard to like put into words really, because to some people they might think it's trivial that it's like just a stone and like just a rock, and well, identify as like quite spiritual, and like I think that it's just kind of like a continued cycle of like white Eurocentric like dominance, and like them like continuing to like control like our narrative, and continue to like harm our community. And like now it almost seems like more complicated because these are like well-intended people and they didn't intend to cause harm, but did anyway. So I guess, sorry, I don't know. Um, I guess it's just really disappointing. I don't, I don't know. And then, yeah, like, because she doesn't really understand the history necessarily, she might not understood how significant it was. And like in my kind of research of like Shinto and Buddhism, how close like Japanese people are to the natural world and how significant that relationship is, to me, I don't perceive it as just a rock. And um, I don't really know how else to communicate that, but yeah.
So if someone were to say, um, well, you're so many generations removed from what happened, why would you be hurt or upset by that? Do you, could you explain to somebody why, somebody who probably does just see it as an object and not um, a piece of spirituality, or you know?
Well, intergenerational trauma is very real. I don't know. It gets stored like in our bodies, in my understanding of it, in my like psychological research. And we carry it with us. It's carried in our DNA, it's carried in our bloodstream. And I think, especially with things like Shigata Ganai, those things weren't really fully felt and processed and communicated and shared. And to whatever degree, like healing looks like for the individual, I don't think it's been fully processed. So it continues to pass on generation through generation. And when the events, the injustices continue to happen, it just re triggers those kind of imprinted experiences, like in my opinion, but I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Patrick, how did you happen to stumble upon the story of the Wakasa monument and what happened?
Yeah, it was on Facebook actually. Social media strikes again. Yeah, I had seen it on Facebook. I think I visited Topaz in 2018, and I think that was around the time when I started to follow the museum on Facebook. So that I think is what really, the fact that I had been following them since then is what clued me into the controversy. Um, and I felt that I needed to respond, as a Topaz descendant, but just on Facebook, some of the comments. But in another life, I was also part of in another life, I was thinking about maybe a career in museums, and I took a little bit of classes on museums. I know this is a new reveal for me, but um, yeah, and one of the things that I was taught when I was learning about museums was that um, the relationship between a museum and its stakeholders is important. And when the controversy erupted, what I saw, I had my reaction as a Topaz descendant, but then also someone who was coming at it from a museum background a little bit. I also saw, this is a situation where um, the stakeholders in the museum, you have a lot of stakeholders who they feel like they're not being heard. And I think that was an element that I felt that I needed to respond to as well. Yeah.
And how did you feel when you heard about, as a, I should say, not with your museum hat on, but with your descendant hat on? Were you upset, or were you just kind of like, okay, that wasn't the best way to go about that?
Yeah, I think I was a little sad. Sadness, I think, was my major emotion that I can remember feeling at the time. Just sadness at how the situation was handled, and that it had resulted in a controversy where everyone wasn't feeling great about what happened. Yeah. That was my primary emotion.
And when you posted on the museum page, do you feel like you were heard as a descendant?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was heard, but I guess the question is heard by whom, right? You know, I definitely feel like I was heard by other Topaz descendants. And you know, I like to think that, you know, the museum heard me as well, but yeah, I definitely felt heard by other Topaz descendants.
And so Saya, how did you feel when you first heard about what had happened?
I think it was pretty shocking because I had been following along with the whole discovery of the monument for a little while. So then to hear that it had been unearthed with no, like, you know, there's all these committees, there's, you know, there have been all these steps taken to make sure that everything's being done in the right way. And then it's just like totally doesn't happen. That was, I think, very shocking. And yeah, I think it's sad because, you know, once something like that happens, you can't go back in time, and now there's all this repairing to do. So it's just, yeah, it's a not great situation for a lot of reasons.
So do you all feel like that there is a Topaz descendant community? Like, do you feel connected to, I mean, other than right now, do you feel connected to other descendants or survivors of Topaz at all? Or do you wish that there were, I guess is the flip side of that. Okay, that'll be for part 2. Oh, Patrick,
I don't feel like I know so many specifically Topaz descendants other than my family and now you guys. So
right.
I resonate a lot with what Saya just said. You know, I feel like I'm on. I feel like that is a journey that I'm on, but I'm still in like the beginning phase of that journey.
Okay, let me make sure that there are not any other questions. Last call for questions. I know we're going on 90 minutes here, so thank you guys for hanging in there. Are there any last remarks that any of you would like to say about being a descendant, about being Yonsei, about Topaz? Yeah.
I guess I didn't speak before about the whole Sansei and Nisei criticism thing, and I'm just thinking about inaction and action and all of these different things, and people not talking about their experiences, and then intergenerational trauma, kind of just like all the things we've been talking about. I think it's good to continue having these conversations, and probably less helpful to think about it as people aren't speaking up enough, because I think there's so many things that might go into that, whether it's not having the knowledge or the resources. And the more Kimiko, like, this is so amazing how you do all these things, because like having these conversations, I think, is so amazing, and connecting people and everyone feeling heard and all of those things, I think, is so important. And so I don't think there should be any like intergenerational warfare. Like, it should be like the sharing of the stories and doing things like this. So thank you.
Yeah, we're all on the same team. Well, thank you. And, you know, the reason why I do all this, it's all purely selfish. It's because, you know, I am also a Yonsei, you know, descendant. So it's like, I'm right here with you on the same journey. So I'm really appreciative that you all were willing to share your thoughts and feelings about being Yonsei and about being a descendant. And I hope that we can do more of these. I would love to be able to have some sort of community of Yonsei. You know, we're at JAMP, we're still trying to figure it out. But we're trying, guys. We're really trying. We're trying to figure out a way to get where people can just, like, you know, hang out and just talk. It doesn't even have to be anything about camp necessarily, but just to realize that there are people out there that have similar experiences to you, and that, you know, your experiences are valid and important. And also, I just want to put a plug out there. Gosei, I'm coming after you next. So if there are any Gosei out there who want to be on a panel, I know there's one backstage right now. My cousin Caroline, Gosei, Topaz Gosei. So I would love to do a discussion with Gosei because I, as a Yonsei, have not had that discussion. I'm sure being a Gosei is different, you know, and I haven't really had those talks. So anyway, okay, I'll stop embarrassing Caroline and I will stop babbling. Okay, so thank you so much for everybody who took the time out to watch and listen. And I hope that if there are Yonsei out there, you feel heard or seen a little bit or you know, reflected in some of the things that we've talked about. And I would love to continue the conversation. So again, anytime anybody wants to have a panel discussion or a group discussion, like email us at JAMP, we will do it. Because that's what we really love to do, is to help foster that community in a virtual way, because, you know, not all of us live on the West Coast, and that's a real luxury for us. So okay, well, I've got nothing else, so I think that we can end it there, and thank you all very much, and hopefully the next one will be some sort of Gosei panel. Okay, well, good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.